Picking up where we left off, at the very end of class, right, we had just finished up talking about what are the main components of natural selection that we need in order for it to occur. So we talked about variation within the population and inheritance, so things need to be different. We need to be able to pass that difference on to the next generation. And that difference needs to provide some sort of advantage, right, which we call fitness. And that advantage falls within one of these three categories, and that's what we define fitness as. So at the very end of class, we looked at, well, what does this really matter? How are we going to start using this? Right? And we know that our kind of overall goal is to look at how does this affect speciation, right, or those groupings of species. And so part of that is looking at how does this affect how organisms are changing and their relationships to one another. And this is the very sort of last thing, I think this was the last thing that we sort of said right at the end of class on Monday. So before we sort of proceed forward and look at, well, how do we track some of these changes and how does this let us see how species are different or related to each other? Is there any questions about anything that we talked about at the end of class on Monday? Okay, so as we think about sort of everything we've talked about up to this point and where we kind of want to go with this, remember kind of our goal is thinking about those species differences and species relationships. There are a few pieces sort of within this that we can focus on. The first of which is sort of these traits that we care about that allow us to understand either differences or relationships. So these traits that we focus on, we call homology. I knew I forgot something. Hang on, I'm so sorry, everyone. I don't have my drawing tool up. There we go.
Are you recording?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much. Almost everything today. Okay, there we go. We call homologies. This is what we see on the left side. Okay, so homology, right, study of sameness. So what we really are looking at here is when we see these similar structures, so we have sort of the arms or the front appendages of several different organisms, right, you see human, cats, whales, and bats, so several different types of mammals. And we can see that this front arm is all, probably not surprisingly, given that they're all mammals, shaped very similarly with all of the same sort of bones. And they're all going to function very similarly. And so as we look at this, right, we know that because they are the same structures, right, the same actual arm bones, right, the humerus, this big bulky beast here, right, or maybe the phalanges, in other words, these little bitsy red bits here, and for us that make up our fingers, or the digits, are all going to be located in the same place, and they're going to serve more or less the same functions. So this is what we're talking about with homology. And this helps us group organisms. Okay, but one thing we do want to be careful about, so we can kind of imagine, classic notes issues, right, because the way I did this, drawing a line down the center of this on the right-hand side, okay, this isn't always super straightforward. So we have what's called homoplasy. Okay, so that prefix homo still being sameness, right, but instead of that ology being study of, that plasy being false, right, insisting falseness. So this is saying false And so there's instances sometimes where things look or act the same, but are not actually the same. The example I have up here now are two different plants that both have thorns on them, right? 2 points. So you think thorns, right? Both look the same. Hey, they're certainly going to act the same. They stabby you, right, and keep you from eating their good bits, okay? But they're not actually the same. Okay? So they're different types of thorns. They kind of trick you into thinking that they're related. Right? So example from our top, okay, the barberry, the Japanese barberry plant, right? Their thorns are coming from the leaves. Okay, whereas our cranberries down here, okay, the thorns are coming, normally we typically think of thorns coming from, right off the stem. We can kind of picture this, right? This is an American plant, this is a Japanese plant, so they're very, very far away from each other, from their origin, so you wouldn't imagine they'd be terribly related, okay? But you can think about if we were going through that exercise that we did in lab last week or the week before, right? Using thorns as sort of our are these related concept could easily trick us, right? So this is something that we need to be very careful about. So this is fake similarity. Okay, so we have homology when they are actually the same, right? They look the same, they act the same, and they are actually coming from the same place. Right? These are fingers, and they're in fingery locations. In homoplasy, they look the same and act the same, but they aren't actually coming from the same place. Right? They're still thorns, okay, but those are thorns coming from leaves, and those are thorns coming from stems. Okay. Another good example of a homeoplasy is if we think about like wings. We'll talk about this later in the semester. If we think about like a bat wing, so we can see this bat wing looks like a hand, okay? Versus like a bird wing. We can all kind of picture a bird wing, right? Or a butterfly wing. And they're all wings. They are still going to all make you fly, okay? But they're not all going to be the same, right? If you all picture a butterfly wing, okay? There's no bones inside that butterfly wing, right? It's just like that thin, easily torn piece of membrane. So they're both wings, okay, but they are not going to structurally be the same. So butterfly wings and bat wings would also both be homoplasies. Okay, same function, both going to get our animals in flight. Okay, but different structures. Okay, they're built differently. Okay. The use of these two and kind of what we want to watch out for here, how we might draw those conclusions clear. Those good examples, that helpful?
How would you use it, like, or why would you ask us this, to know this?
So for now, like this is our understanding of how do we categorize organisms. All right. So the question was, what are we using this information for? Right. So for us, right, in an earlier class, this is understanding how do we categorize organisms, right? So using things like homologies, right, building relationships within the classes, okay, and being careful not to use things like homoplasies. And we're going to run into both of these things as we go. Okay, in later classes, you'll actually get to use some of these things. Okay, the other thing that we're going to encounter are what are called vestigial structures, and we'll see this particularly in mammals, although not exclusively. So vestigial structures are parts of the body that have become obsolete. So a good example of this is what I have circled here, right, which is the pelvis in aquatic mammals, right? So we did a really great job. Don't forget your white. I think it was Monday when you guys were picking endothermic, homeothermic, fusiform organisms from that Menti, and we identified that the dolphin, right, if we pick that out as a dolphin, was a mammal, right? So that was an endothermic, homeothermic, fusiform organism. So as a mammal, okay, any of those organisms are going to have lungs, okay? They're going to be endothermic and all of these other features that make mammals mammals. And that includes, right, having shoulders just like we do and having pelvises just like we do. And like we see here, this is a whale skeleton. Having a pelvis underwater isn't super useful, just like it's not with the fishes that we'll end up looking at. And so fishes don't have them because fishes evolved first. Stop. Thank you. And so what we see here is called a vestigial structure. In other words, a floating pelvis. Let's see, here's a regular pelvis. And so normally, right, pelvises are big, bulky things. They hold your legs together, help you deal with gravity. None of this stuff happens in the water, right, because water holds big, bulky things up. That's why whales and stuff can get so big. But it's very difficult to make genes, right, completely disappear. So what we find is these vestigial structures still get coded, they still get made, even though they don't provide hugely valuable services anymore. So here we have the pelvis in the whale. Humans have this kind of stuff too, right? Things like your appendix still gets made, okay, even though it's not providing a hugely valuable service anymore. Okay, wisdom teeth are like this as well, right? Our mouths are not even really big enough, right, or hardy enough to really need them anymore, so we often get them removed, right, but they still get made. We don't really need them. And so these are all examples of vestigial structures, right? Things that as organisms have moved past them due to habitat or habits, we no longer use the structures, okay, but they're still coded in the gene, so they're still going to get made. Okay, it's very hard to completely erase something from your genes. Did that feel okay? Any questions about that one? Okay, so this gives us kind of an idea, right? Because we see this in a whale, right? We can get an idea of who was the whale related to. Why would it have that? Okay, so who else has pelvises? This is one of the first things that let us know between that and lungs that whales weren't fishes. We didn't figure that out as long ago as you'd like to think. Okay, so these are the tools that we use to help understand relationships between organisms, right? And so we can imagine how those would be more tools that we could have used during our case study that we did either last week or the week before. So any questions about any of those pieces? Okay, so the next thing I want to do is hop in and talk about, so what exactly is a species then? Okay, so how exactly did these classes and subclasses and orders and species actually come about, and how do they stay separate? Okay, why are skates and rays not breeding with each other, right? They look pretty similar to me. Okay, so what's keeping them apart? Okay? So when we're thinking about species in general, okay, really remember that all we're talking about is divergence. And so very generally, yep, okay, that's right, thank goodness, is that differentiation through time, right? So if we think back to our, pardon me, definition of natural selection, okay, here we have our population. We have some variation, right, different colors of green. And so we would assume, okay, that there's some advantage to being one color of green versus the other. Okay, so we'll talk about some different scenarios. Okay, that may lead, so if we were to just, let's ignore this side for now, for the sake of simplicity. Okay, so if we just follow our left-hand side here, all right, there's maybe some benefit to being this like less bluish green, right? So the greener of the greens. Okay. So what are these circumstances that lead them to go this way? Okay. And as we get up here then, we have, of course, our darker green and our lighter green. Okay. So what causes these guys to sort themselves? Okay, maybe these guys are hiding in tall grass. Maybe these guys are hiding in leaves from their predators. Okay, use your camouflage appropriately. All right, so we're using all of our processes of natural selection, and this is going to cause some issues with our species. So we're going to look at how this is sorting itself out. Ooh. No, come back to you. Okay, so here's what this means, right? Remember, ultimately we're using this term divergence, literally just meaning separation. Is going to lead us to two distinct species, at least. We're going to keep it nice and simple. And this is using all of the information that we've talked about up to this point. Okay, so you've done this a little bit before, right? If you did Bio 130 with me, okay, or Dr. J, right, because she did the labs as well, right? We did that Battle of the Beaks business, right? So we talked about having different beaks allows you to be better in different habitats. So this is going to be very similar to that kind of concept, right? Remember these two features here, right? That having variation and any variation, right? Remember this can be, your environmental driver can be things like predators, right? But it also can be due to sex. But this can drive a change. And so remember, we want to think about fitness is that adaptive driver on that variation. So it can be anything under those three S's. So variation is what starts the change. Okay, so what we just talked about with evolution is only what starts our separation. Okay, we have some darker green ones and some lighter green ones. This is what's going to start our separation. So then what we want to ask is, if we have some separation started, what's to keep them from breeding, right? I have robins and yellow warblers. Fine, they look different, right? They sing different songs. Still does not necessarily explain why they don't hang out, have little birdie raves, all that sort of business. Okay, that still leaves us to that question, right? They still seem similar enough to me. A bird's a bird, a bird. Rude. little thing. Okay, so here's where we're starting, right? So if we had our two populations, okay, like our previous one, we had the dark brown and the light brown. Okay, so maybe our example is we had brown and green. That's our variation. And that's giving me some kind of thickness advantage. Okay, if I was green, okay, I could use that to camouflage. I can hide from predators, say in grasses or leaves. If I was brown, okay, I could also hide from predators, but I wouldn't be able to do it in the grass, right? I would stick out like a sore thumb. So I would need to hide in something like dirt or soil. Okay, this would cause my population to separate. Okay, so a green individual would have to hang out in the grasses most of the time because it's safe there. So I'm going to live in different structures most of the time. I'm probably going to eat different things that live in the grasses where I'm hanging out. Okay, same thing with our brown individuals. They're going to be hanging out in the dirty areas. Okay, probably build burrows, eat things that live in the dirt. So even if we hang out sometimes, right, we're going to hang out less and less and less. Right, because I'm going to be safest where I'm best hidden. So as a brown individual, right, I'm going to spend most of my time in the dirt with other brown, dirt-colored bugs. Okay, and less time with other green-colored bugs. Right, because the more time I spend with green-colored bugs, the more likely I am to die. Remember, death is bad. Right, because then I don't get to breed and do all of that natural selection-y stuff. So this is the beginning of where we see this separation or this speciation occurring, right? Because it's dangerous or literally deadly for me to party with the other half of my group. That's like a bad version of Footloose. Okay, so this is where that fitness component comes in, right? I become less fit if I mingle with individuals, okay, or if I mingle more specifically into the other type of habitat. Right, that makes me less fit if I'm mismatched. Okay, and they're less fit if they come party with me. Okay, so this is where our story begins when we're thinking about speciation. Is still good, everybody with me so far? You can kind of see how we've led up to this point over the last day or two. Okay, so where we want to go to from here then is now what? Okay, now that we're at this impasse, okay, we've joined the plot line of Footloose, okay, without Kevin Bacon. Okay, so what happens now? We can't have our party. Okay, so what makes speciation happen? How exactly do we go from two kind of different colors within the same group to two clearly separate groups that can't ever talk to each other at all anymore? Okay, so there's a couple of different ways this can happen, and we can lump them into two large categories, okay, that all fall under the umbrella of reproductive isolation. Okay, and this is really what we're talking about here when we say we can't party anymore, right? We mean we're going to become completely isolated from one another. Okay, literally, I will not recognize you as part of my group any longer. Okay, so if Noah and I start as the same group, but I'm dirt colored and he's grass colored, this eventually is going to go so far that I will literally not recognize the language Noah speaks any longer when this is done. Okay, so this is what we mean when we say isolation. So how do we get there? Okay. The first way this happens, and where this starts, is called pre-zygotic. Okay, so think pre, we mean before, right? Okay, so these first couple, or this group, the goal of this is to prevent our sperm and our egg from ever meeting. Okay, this does not necessarily mean our males and females from our green and our brown group won't ever mate. Okay, but it does mean the sperm and the egg won't ever bond. Okay, now ideally, okay, our male and our female won't meet. Okay, but if nothing else, this is the goal, right? The black gate. Okay, so there are several different things that our organisms can do to prevent or reinforce that party from ever happening. Okay, so let's look at the techniques or the systems in place to keep our party from occurring. Oh, that kind of stinks. Let's see if I can get this out of the way. Oh, let's make it worse. Oh. This is not really a good place for that, is there? All right, first thing that occurs is we start to see temporal isolation. Okay, so our groups start to separate what they do by time. Okay, now this can mean several things. And you see I have a couple of examples there. Okay, but so our individuals can shift the time of day that they're active. So you may have one that's out during the day versus nocturnal. You can get shifts from dawn to dusk. Okay, this can both be feeding and awakeness. Okay, or as you see, I have seasonality also listed up here. So it can be something as simple as shifting their breeding time. So I have a toad example up here. So I have two very similar breeds of toads here in America. They actually live in a very similar location as well, but their breeding season is separated by a handful of months. Okay, so the American toad, okay, breeds in early summer, May and June. Okay, and the Fowler toads breed in late summer, July, August, early September. Okay. So because of this, okay, these individuals are never going to crossbreed, right? Because they're not interested in breeding at the same time. Okay, so this is one way that they keep themselves separate. So when they had, there we go, that's what I want, started to separate early on, okay, as females and males got interested in breeding earlier on, and these individuals started becoming interested later in the season, right, that began to separate them out. Okay, so we could imagine, for example, our dirt-colored individuals in our example, right, wanting to breed earlier in the season. It's hot and all that exposed dirt. We wouldn't want to be out laying eggs in the uncovered dirt late summer. They'd all dry out maybe, right? Whereas maybe our green-colored insects, right, want to wait until the lush vegetation cover is all grown in to help cover things. We would maybe start to see some separation there. Okay. The next thing we see is habitat isolation. Okay, so literally, we're just not going to hang out. I'm not ever going to see you. Which means we won't ever meet and fall in love and have beautiful little babies, right? So this one directly sort of connects to the example we've been working, right? Because we have one part of our population living in the dirt, one part of our population living in the grass, okay? But this isn't uncommon, okay? We have very closely related species, for example, of a sister to like the garter snake, and one tends to live on land or in very sort of broken sandy areas, okay? And the other that lives, breeds, and lays its eggs along the shorelines and in the water, right? So these two guys would not meet. And if they did, they wouldn't really hang out, right? Because the terrestrial version, not so much with the whole water business. You can spray it with a hose and it's going to run away. All right, so these two guys, kind of like a cat, right, are not going to hang out. All right, they're not even really going to recognize each other as the same kind of snake. Like, why you wet, bro? Right, more complicated, English today, more complicated and very commonly, behavioral is a way as well. This is something, so I have several versions of, for example, birds. And birds are not the only ones we see do this, but this is sort of a famous example. So there are a lot of different ways behaviors can keep organisms apart, okay? So on the far right side, I have several different examples of nest building that can keep organisms apart. Burrows also fall under this example. Fishes, for example, have actually some very complicated nest burrows and designs. There's some great cichlids that actually draw shapes in the sand around their nests in order to attract females, and also do this sort of like rock shape and colors. What you see here are actually examples of bower birds, which I'm not a huge bird person. If you know me, I'm going to make a big deal about this later. But bower birds are one of the ones I like. I think this is a really cool thing. So each species of bower birds is actually obscenely specific in the shape and the color of things that they collect to put in front of it to attract their mates. And they actually make these bowers, which is not the nest that they're even going to put the eggs in. This is just like a bachelor pad to attract the ladies in. It's very cool. And so you can see there's very particular things that they're doing. And so if I am a lady bowerbird that only likes red things, as very cool as that top bower nest is, right, I wouldn't recognize it as a bower. I wouldn't be interested in it, right? I might even destroy it because birds are just mean things. I'm not gonna lie, okay? We also see, for example, very complicated dancing rituals, okay? This is both for meeting, right, and re-meeting mates, okay? The songs that you hear, okay, is very specific language. To us, it even sounds like mush sometimes. There's so many different songs going on, right? But birds really only hear, right, the same species. They only hear their own language. Humans are kind of crappy at this too, right? We constantly say, I don't understand what you say, you have an accent. You understood fine, okay? But we do have really bad ears, right? And we have a tendency to only hear the language and accents that we've been exposed to, right? Some of us don't try very hard to hear other things, right? So this is what some of this comes down to. Now, of course, we're not separated in any way, shape, or form. Humans are just kind of jerks. But it's the same kind of concept, right? Where what you hear is what you recognize, okay? What you've experienced the most, and what you're most likely to respond to. Okay. Now, all organisms do this. I've only brought up birds, of course. This goes all the way, like spiders do this kind of business, right? There's peacock spiders that do fancy dances. Birds just have kind of the most fantastical version. Okay, any questions so far before we move on? Does this feel okay? Okay, now remember when we started this, I mentioned that while the goal was to keep our couple from ever actually meeting and partying, okay, the overall definition is just making sure the sperm and egg don't meet. So while our first three here prevent meeting, okay, our last two, okay, are just going to prevent the actual egg and sperm from actually, so I guess this is going to prevent organisms from meeting. Our last two are going to prevent the gametes from meeting, the sperm and the egg. Okay, so kind of we can almost think about as we go through these, okay, we're getting closer and closer and closer. Okay, we need some more last-ditch efforts to kind of prevent this from occurring. Fine. So now we need a different kind of birth control. So this is mechanical. All right, so beyond all odds are Romeo and Juliet, okay, ignored the time of day, leapt over the walls of the river, okay, and ignored the language barriers and have fallen madly in love. How romantic. Okay, so despite all of that, we still have some mechanical problems. Okay, meaning that while they're hooking up, so to speak, okay, they're not going to actually be able to successfully do so. Okay, so for whatever type of genital system we're talking about, okay, whether there's some sort of intromittent organ, meaning some sort of like penis and vagina system, or maybe it's a series of cloacas, they're never going to match up. Okay, meaning there's no fit. This is what we're going with my very classy lock and key analogy. Okay, so because there's no fit, okay, either they match up or don't match up, or they literally don't fit together, okay, you can't actually pass on the sperm to the female. Okay? So one more layer of protection. Even though they got together, right, it basically just turns into a very awkward makeout session. Which definitely means they won't be calling each other back. But we're getting a little close for comfort here. Okay, still feel good? Okay, so we've got one left. Okay, and now we've gotten too close. All right, so our lovers have met. They've ignored all the warning signs. Oh, that's right. Forgot I did that. Keep going, man. Okay, and we got past the mechanical issues. Okay, so the sperm, in this case, was deposited into the female. Okay, but remember, this is pre-zygotic isolation. So, fine. Okay, there's no rules that say that that can't happen. The rule just said the sperm and the egg can't meet. Not that the sperm and the female can't meet, right? So we're pushing it all the way down to the wire. So our very last type of pre-zygotic, right? So in other words, literally before the forming of the zygote, version of isolation is gametic. Okay, so I'm literally going to prevent a gamete from meeting. Okay, so this is my last ditch effort, right? There's literally nowhere to go from here. My gametes are hanging out in the same space. My sperm has gotten to my egg. And basically what's going to happen is the sperm cannot actually bind to that egg, right? It's rejected. It gets all the way there. Okay, and it can't actually bind and mix. Okay, so our sperm gets to the egg, right, and it's murdered brutally, okay, by an outside coating on our egg. All right, stop. Literally dead. Okay, last ditch effort. Despite all the warning signs, okay, we still managed to keep our egg unfertilized. Okay, so these are all the steps that we can take for pre-zygotic isolation. So we have 5 different methods we can use, and we can use more than one, right? We don't just have to pick one. So we could have behavioral and habitat and mechanical. It doesn't matter, right? The more we have, the less likely we are to be mixing, right, between two populations. Right, so the more isolation we have, the more support we have to separate those two populations. Okay, any questions about these 5? Okay, so remember these were all pre-zygotic isolation types. So we wanted to say, what can we do to reinforce speciation before fertilization occurs, right? So before the sperm and the egg meet. But we know that that's not going to be 100%. So what happens, or how can we reinforce species, right? Try to say these should be separate if and when, okay, zygotes do happen. And they're going to, right? So there's a lot less of these, right? Because we don't want this post-zygotic business to happen as frequently. Okay, so when we look at these, this is still reproductive isolation, right? Our goal is to have isolated populations. Remember, I don't want to recognize the other population when this is over. Okay, but these are ones that reinforce this issue after the fact. Okay, after our Romeo and Juliet have already met, right, had their tryst, their night of passion, and something perhaps came of it. Okay, so all of the pre-zygotic mechanisms that we just talked about failed. So now we have to look at post-zygotic. Okay, so after our sperm and our egg have met, we've created some sort of offspring. And so now we want to say if these are truly separate species, okay, we have our brown species and our green species. If they were to create an offspring, okay, that offspring is going to be less fit, right? Because they're going to have some kind of mix of genes, right? They're going to be like baby poop brown. They're not going to be green enough to be well hidden in the grass, I'm not going to be brown enough to be well hidden on the dirt. So hopefully I run really fast, I guess. Right, because I've lost some of that piece in there. Right, hence my shark kitten, who is also doomed. Okay, so we're just going to start looking at these because we're certainly not going to have time to get through them all. All right, so what are our options? Keep in mind, of course, we're not choosing these. These are things that would happen. All right, so the first thing that can happen is what's called hybrid inviability. So when I use the term hybrid here, this is our mixed offspring. Okay, mixed referring to the offspring between two different species or two populations that are turning into species, right? So in this case, our brown and our green, right? Or the baby between the robin and the warbler, right? That would be a hybrid. Okay, so hybrid inviability, in other words, the baby of, right, two different populations or a mixed baby, is inviable. They literally mean can't survive. Okay, this only happens if the organisms that we're working with are already very, very, very different. Okay, so maybe they have a different number of chromosomes, for example, so they can't go through mitosis appropriately.
So this happens like in the womb.
This would happen in the womb, right, directly after fertilization. And this would happen very early on, right? Less than 10 cells kind of thing. So you would not see any kind of significant development. Right, and so this is what I mean apoptosis, right? Literally means cell death. So you would basically see fertilization of that egg, and then with a handful of mitosis, it would immediately die. Okay, I have our Socrative up. There we go. We will pick up right where we left off. I'll re-review hybrid inviability, and then we'll finish up here on Friday. Once you've completed my back 2 rows, you're welcome to go. Please have a wonderful day. Be safe and stay warm.